You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Well, hello again, everyone. This is Leadership Powered by Common Sense, and I'm Doug Thorpe, your host. Today, I've got the privilege of inviting back a guest who was with me in the early days of this show. In fact, while we were standing in the green room, we were talking a little bit, reminiscing. He was actually show number 66 in the early days, and things have changed since then. We, of course, are not far from show 300, so we've got a lot of miles on the chassis now and learned things about our process here. But my guest, his name is Bryan Gillette. Bryan, welcome to the show.
Doug, it's nice to be back on your show. Congratulations on soon to be reaching 300 shows. That's quite a milestone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And folks, if you don't remember Bryan, if you didn't catch the earlier episode, Bryan is in my humble opinion, the epitome of a high performance human being. He has trained and endured and done some pretty amazing things. And Bryan, first, I guess to level set, let's just dial all the way back and hit some of the high points and some of the things you have chosen to do. And more importantly, the question, why? Why do you do what you do?
Well, the easy question, Doug, is kind of the what. The harder question to answer is the why, but we'll see if we can get into that one. So, yeah, I dealt with a lot of performance, a lot on the ultra distance side, but I'm a former VP of human resources, so I've been in the executive ranks before and seen kind of what performance is needed in the corporate world. But I know you and I talked a lot about kind of what I've done on the ultra distance side. So going back many, many years, I cycled across the United States, so 4,000 miles across the United States when I was 20. But more recently, and so I've done a lot on ultra distance around biking 300 miles in one day, a number of 200-mile or 100-mile bike rides. And then at one point I thought, I want to run a marathon, because that's kind of the ultimate in running. And I had never been a runner. And so I set my sight on running a marathon, did a marathon in San Francisco. And then as most crazy ideas happen, there's a couple of guys sitting around and somebody threw out the idea, why don't we do a 50-mile trail run? And so we did the 50-mile trail run. That led to a few more. It led to a 100-mile trail run, which eventually led to a 205-mile run around Lake Tahoe, which you do it in kind of one span. So I completed it in 76 hours. You can sleep as much or as little as you want. I had about 90 minutes of sleep. And so every once in a while, kind of sit down but you keep going. So that's one of the bigger ones that I've done. And then since you and I have recorded, we did our recording back about almost 2 years ago, there's a few more things we can talk about.
Yeah, and go ahead, tell us a few more of those things. Some of them are fascinating, and I definitely want to know a lot more.
So since we recorded, I had heard about these guys that did a 24-hour walk, and I've done 24-hour events. I've done 24 hours on a bicycle. I've done 24 hours running. Did the 76 hours running, and I thought, and most of those you have a distance that you're trying to reach, whether it's 100 miles or 200 miles or 300 miles, and time is less of the issue. And so I had read about these guys that did a 24-hour walk. And I thought that would be fun to do with my family, because you walk, you're not worried about speed at all. You just kind of got to keep moving. So I threw it out to my family. I have two boys who are teenagers, and my wife, who is an Ironman. They all said, yeah, let's try it. So about 2 years ago, two Thanksgivings ago, we decided, okay, we're going to walk 24 hours. We're going to start at our house and we're going to walk around. We live in a town of about 80,000 people. And so we're gonna stay kind of within the city limits and just walk. We had no set route, and we were just going to walk. And it's like, okay, let's go right, and we'd go right. And when we got hungry, we would head over to a restaurant, get some food, eat, and then continue walking. And about probably right after dinner, my son's, I think he was 14 at the time, his foot really started to hurt him. And there's that point in a parent's life, and I'm sure many people can realize, it's like, okay, I don't want to push my son into something that's unsafe. And he may not be the one that stops himself. So my wife and I figured we're going to be the ones that would stop the walk. And what we agreed on early on is any one of us could stop the walk if we wanted to, and we all stopped. We started as a team. We were going to finish as a team, so we had to work together. And I knew my son wasn't going to stop, so my wife and I decided, okay, we're going to. And so I went up and I talked to him. I said, and we were at 24 miles. And I said, how about if we just try to get to 26.2 miles, which is a marathon, and then we call it a day? Because you're sore. He goes, no, I want to keep going. and then it's like, okay, now what do we do?
Now, what life lesson do you want to enforce?
That's right. So, and I'm not sure this was the best parenting moment, but he said, can I have some Advil? So we gave him some Advil to calm the pain down, and it's like, we're gonna, my wife and I were mentally prepared to stop, and especially my wife. And so he said, he goes, like an hour later, half hour later, he goes, pain's going. I said, why don't we stop? He goes, no, I don't want to stop. So we kept going until about 1 a.m. So I think we're 18 hours in, 17 hours in. And my wife had gotten it into her head that we were going to stop. And so it was mental.
Oh.
And she said, I don't want to keep going. And so we all stopped. And so we made it, I think about 32 miles, 18 hours or so. And we stopped. And there were some things we did to try to make sure, okay, this is the right decision. So fast forward the next year, and my son, who was the one who was really hurting, he says, I want to try this again. And so he and I and a friend of his tried it. And we did the full 24 hours, I think it was just over 50 miles that we did. And it's like, it was such a cool experience. So did that, the other thing that we can talk about, completed a marathon on a ship down in Antarctica just a few months ago, and then currently training to climb Kilimanjaro.
Wow. So we teased the question, why, Bryan? Why do you think you do these things?
It's a great question. I always like something, I am not great at going to the gym in the morning and kind of, doing that, unless I need some sort of goal to keep me kind of staying in shape and kind of keep me moving. So that's one reason. My wife is great. She'll get up and she'll exercise. She would go to the gym. So she's really good at that. I like to have some sort of goal that requires me to stay in shape. And I think, both work. I think actually my wife's might be a little bit more healthy. But I also like to have some big thing, whether it's physical or mental. And in most of these things that I'm talking about are both physical and mental. I like to have some big thing that I'm chasing and kind of going after, because it keeps me alive. And so that's one of the big whys, why I like to do it. And then where it was fun to do this with my son, and we're climbing Kilimanjaro as a family, because it shows them that, to get to the top of a mountain, to achieve really hard things, whether it's work, whether it's in sport, it's hard. It takes a lot of hard work. It takes training. It takes dedication, and you don't just do it tomorrow. you gotta have that goal in place. So I wanted them to be able to see that, and so that's why I was excited that my son completed the 24-hour walk.
That's awesome. Well, and I would argue in terms of life experience that I think the biggest challenges ultimately come down to the mental more so than the physical.
Absolutely.
You're number one, and I'm speaking from my own experience training in the military. There were things I was asked to do in my military training that if you just put it out in front of me originally, it was like, no way, no, I'm not going to do that. But then, of course, you kind of have no choice but to try. And then when you get into it and you realize, especially if it's more of an endurance, time-bound exertion, it becomes more of a mental thing than a physical thing. Yeah, your body gets tired, or you might actually be hurting a little bit, sore muscles, sore joints, and things like that. But ultimately, the endurance becomes more mental than it is the physical.
You are spot on there, and you saw it in the military. And thank you for your service, Doug. And so often, and I talk to groups about this a lot. So often, we hear of something big, and we say, "Oh man, I can't do that." Whether it's a project at work that your boss says, "Hey, I need you to do X." And you think, man, we can't do that. And what I hear from groups a lot of times is, especially with some of the running and cycling I've done, they'll say, "Oh, I couldn't run a marathon." And most people can. Unfortunately, only about 1% of the US populations run a marathon. Now, I was reading an article today in the New York Times about how the marathon is becoming more popular. And so the average speed of a marathon is slowing down because you're getting older people that are going in, even though the fastest person is speeding up. But you're seeing these more and more people do it. And so I would argue that most people could run a marathon. Most people just choose not to. So we're quick to say at times, "Oh, I can't do that." And maybe the answer in reality is, I can't do that today. But what would I have to do to be able to do that tomorrow? Mm-hmm. And I remember the first time, I did a marathon. I was not a runner. I was a cyclist, and I went out and I ran 4 miles, and I came back and it's like, oh, my legs were so sore. And it's like, I got to do 22.2 more miles. And it's like, okay, the next week you do 5 miles and then 6 miles. So you build on it. Right. But it is totally mental. And I've done a number of events with people that are in better physical shape than me, who haven't finished or who barely finished because they lost it up in their head.
Yeah. Talking about marathons, my oldest son was a runner in his early days in high school. He ran cross country, so that's, long distance and things like that. And then one year, a while back, he had already gotten into the work world in his adult life, just kind of out of the clear blue. He said, "Guess what? I signed up for the Houston Marathon." And I'm going, I said, to my knowledge, you're not training. He goes, "No." And I said, "You're just going to go run a marathon?" And he goes, "Yeah." He said, "I'll probably do a little bit of training to loosen up, but I'm just going to go try. It's kind of a bucket list. I want to see if I can do it." So, okay, cool. So, my wife and I got up bright and early that Sunday and went down to the headquarters, and you may know, you probably experienced it. They've got these really cool little tracker chips, and they've got this monitor that you can watch the progress of your, the person you're supporting. So we went over the starting line, gun went off, everybody took off. So we went back to the convention center where they had these monitors set up, and we were tracking him. And I started talking to this lady next to me, and she's tracking her son, and she said, "Oh, I'm so proud. He's been working so hard. This is his first marathon, da-da-da." And I'm going, "Yeah, mine too." This is his first marathon, but I didn't say anything about training. And she goes, "Where's your son?" Or they were, "Where's your son?" And they were right like neck and neck at about mile 2, you know. And so I'm going, okay, cool. So we kind of went on about our business, and about an hour and a half later, we went back to these monitors, and lo and behold, here's this woman. She's still beaming. She said, "My son's doing so well. He's up here at East Mile, probably at that point about 16 or something like that. And still a good ways to go, and nowhere close to the winners. You know, the winners were almost ready to come in, and but she goes, I said, "Where's your son?" And she finds his dot on the map, and I said, "Oh, that's cool. Yeah, he's good." And she goes, "Where's your son?" I said, "Well, I don't know. Let me look." My son was about 3 miles ahead of him. And she goes, "Wow, that's amazing." She goes, "How long has your son been training for this thing?" And I looked at my watch and I said, "About 30 minutes. And he's just always been, he's very thin. He's got a runner's body, so he's blessed with that part of his metabolism and all. But he finished, he was done, and I said, "So what do you think?" And he goes, "Got it, check the box, and probably not ever going to do it again."
How did he feel the next day? Because he was probably hurting.
He was hurting, but he really wasn't. He wasn't debilitated or anything. You know, he was sore. He definitely was sore, but he just kind of shook it off, and you know.
Yeah, it's funny when you tell that story, because when we were doing the 24-hour walk with my son the second time, he wasn't training at all. And I've done lots of running. I know what it's like to be out 24 hours. I can go do. I felt fairly confident I could do it. And I said to him, I said, you might want to go out and run a little more or train a little bit more. And he was doing cross country. But there's a difference between running 3 miles and walking 52 miles. And I thought either way, there's going to be a good lesson. If we make it, there's going to be that lesson like, I can do anything.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't make it, there's going to be the lesson of, all right, this is hard stuff. I need to work harder to get there. And he made it. So just like your son made it. So there is a lesson in everything that we do, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah. So real quick, you touched on the marathon on board a ship in the Antarctic. Talk a little more about that experience.
So we, as a family, we were heading down to Antarctica. We headed down there just after Christmas, a few months ago. And I knew it's a fairly small ship. It holds about 190 passengers. And I knew they had a track on the ship, a running track. And I thought, how cool would it be to run a marathon? Because you have a fair amount of time that you're not doing anything. How cool would it be to run a marathon down in Antarctica on a ship? And so just got that idea. They come to me. I threw it out to my family to see if anybody wanted to join. And my wife, who's the smartest of the four of us, just quickly said, "No."
I know where this is going. Yeah.
And she's generally okay with many of the things I do. She said, "No, I'm not doing it. I don't want to do it." Both my kids said yes. And I said, okay, it's going to, running a marathon's hard. It's going to take work. We're going to have to train. And they both kind of fell off and one decided not to do it. He was having, some foot problems. And so he decided not to. And then the other, he was doing cross country, and his heart wasn't in it enough. And he knew that kind of doing cross country and training for a marathon would be tough to do. And so I said, okay, I'm going to keep doing it. And so it is a 1/12 of a mile course. So it's 315 laps that you have to do.
Wow.
And I knew I could run the distance. The hardest part, the two hardest parts was it just going to be sheer boredom? And because you're just doing this 315, laps. But the harder part, one of the other harder parts was we were on the ship for 11 days. And normally in a marathon, okay, I'm training, I'm going to do it on, June 15th and everything you back into it. I wasn't sure, am I going to do it on the first day? Am I going to do it on the last day? I wasn't sure what day. It was one of these things I had to fill it in, kind of, find it a time that, I had 5 hours where we weren't doing anything. I could just go out and run it. So there was that mental component of, all right, so you wake up, it's like, we're going to do it today. But the hardest part was, how was I going to count the laps? Because I had to keep track of the laps. And it's like, I spent more brain power trying to figure that one because I knew that I couldn't just count it in my head. Because, you'd get to lap 3 and it's like, all right, what lap am I on now? And normally I can do GPS on my watch.
Oh, yeah.
But you're on a moving ship. And so the GPS is going to track, the movement of the ship, not necessarily the movement of you. So eventually, I found I have an Apple Watch. I found there was an app that I could just, every lap I click my screen, it was a counter. I was thinking I get one of those counters you use in baseball. Yeah, like that.
Pitch count. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but eventually I just used a counter on my watch and went around. So I would do 50 laps one way, turn around and go 50 laps the other way, and then turn around and do 50 laps. And it was, it started to snow. It was windy, but it was a little over 4 hours. It was a great experience. And I was up on top of the ship, a fairly small ship, but I could look down into the pool and the hot tub, and nobody was using the pool because it was cold. But there were people that would sit in the hot tub and they would just see me doing laps.
Who was that guy?
And they would come and then they'd go and then somebody else would come. And so most people weren't paying attention, but I came down that night for dinner and I'm walking a little slow and a couple people came, "What were you doing up there?" Because my son would come up and he would hold food for me. And so I would grab a banana and I'd be eating the banana as we were running around. And so it was a great experience.
How'd you deal with the cold being that close to the Antarctic?
Yeah, so people often think Antarctica is colder than it actually is. If you're in the middle of the continent, it's really cold. It's in the minus 30s and 40s. When you're on the Antarctic Peninsula, it's in the 30s.
Okay.
So it's not that bad. So running in the 30s is very doable. It's, tights. I have a long sleeve shirt. I have light gloves on, and then a beanie just to keep my head warm.
Yeah.
So, and that's you're good with that.
So let's, with all of that said, and all of the performance pressure and stress and ultimately accomplishment, how do you correlate that to success in the business world? I know that's ultimately what you do and how you help people, but let's just kind of paint the landscape there. How does some of this translate?
Yeah, and I think it's a good question, and I want to talk to something you and I were talking a little bit about in the green room as well. I put out a book about 2 years ago called Epic Performance, and what EPIC stands for, the E is how do you envision the big things, the P is how do you plan for it, the I is how do you iterate and kind of work your way up to it, C is how do you collaborate and learn from others, and then lastly, how do you go out and perform? And I'd interviewed 100 kind of executives and ultra distance or athletes to understand what do they do, because I wanted to talk to people in the business community to basically tying into what your question's about. And a number of things that I heard is those folks, both in business and sport, they were very focused on what they were trying to accomplish. They knew what they were going after, and they focused in that direction. And that allowed them to stay focused on what they needed to stay focused on, but it also allowed them to not focus on those other distractions. They knew when to say no to certain things. And when I talk with groups, I talk how we have 168 hours in our week. And how you choose to use those 168 hours is in many cases up to you. And so what are you doing that's moving you in your direction? And what are you saying no to that's impacting your direction? Very deliberate. So this group was very deliberate and very focused on what they were doing. And one thing you and I were talking to, which I want to hear a little bit more kind of from you, is you got to stick to it. You know, running a marathon is hard. And I often say that, the halfway point, so a marathon is 26.2 miles. The halfway point often in a marathon is somewhere around 20 to 22 miles. That's where it really gets hard. The first 20 miles isn't that bad. It's the next 6.2 that's really hard. And so you got to stick to it. And as you and I were talking about in the beginning, it's like you're coming up to almost 300 podcasts. And I asked you, I said, Doug, so did you think you were going to get this far? And you said, yeah, I just had to stick to it. So, what is it? I'd love your perspective, and I'm sure the listeners would as well. I'd say, what allowed you to stick to it and keep doing that? Those 300.
Well, it is a great question. And just to elaborate a little more on the kind of level set here, what we were talking about, and this was in the green room before we kicked off here, folks. Bryan's been on my show before. I mentioned he was show number 66, and here we are coming up on nearly 300. And he said, wow, And what I shared was that for me, when I turned my attention to producing his show, I sought advisory help. I talked to some podcast coaches and gurus and things. Actually, I had a couple on my early shows. And one of the key things that always kept recurring, regardless of who I talked to in this space, was don't give up, stick to it. Too many originators of this kind of content, they get up to maybe like 30 or 40 shows and it just feels like a drag. There's too much to worry about. There's too many things. So for me, number one was the focus. And I firmly believed in what I wanted to do with the show and had my own basis for believing it was the right thing to be doing in respect to what I do as a business coach and advisor and executive coach. So I wanted to have guests and tell these stories. Every one of my episodes has a guest. There's not a single episode where I'm the talking head. Number one, that's kind of one of my standards. But I always like to engage in these discussions so we can get some insights and perspectives on leadership and leadership development. And I'm firmly locked in on that. So then for me to avoid the hassles of putting on a show, the next immediate step was process. What process could I implement that could squeeze as much of the pain and frustration out of producing a show as possible? And I figured that out. I got that part accomplished. And so now the format that we use to record minimizes the amount of editing we've got to do. I've got a kind of a wrapper that everything goes in when it gets to production. I change and upgrade that periodically. I mean, the 2003 series of shows look different than my 2004. And I'll probably change it again next year, just to iterate that way. But anyway, it was the ability to get a process that minimized the struggle to get it out and put all that together.
Yeah, and some of the things you were talking about, or many of the things I heard from the 100 people I interviewed for the book. I mean, you were very clear on why you were doing this and what you wanted to do. Which in terms of the book, it's like that envision process. You knew what it looked like. You always wanted to have a guest on, and then that process point. I mean, I think that iterate is how I often talk about. It allows you to be more efficient. You learn from previous things. You talked about how You learn from some of your earlier guests. And that is so important in this process, whether it's work, whether it's endurance. It's like, okay, what did I do last week that worked or didn't work, and how am I making that better? And then that perseverance, that kind of sticking to it. It allows, what I heard from you is you were able to keep going because you knew you knew why you were doing it. And I often look at, when I'm talking to people and they're having a tough time kind of finishing it, it's like, go back and ask, why are you doing that? I mean, I remember I got my master's years ago, and I was deep in the kind of the earlier parts of my career. And at the time I was working probably 60 hours a week and then going to school and getting a master's. And it was hard. And there were components where it's like, oh, can I keep doing this? And at one point I thought, do I just stop for a year and take a break? And I thought, okay, if I stop, if I keep going, in a year, I'm going to be done. If I stop and take a year off, then I'm going to have another year going. So how do I keep moving and kind of thinking about, why am I doing this? What's the benefit when I come out of it? And I teach, up at the university now, and I see this all the time with some of these grad students where it's like, oh, do I keep going? And I invite the president of the university in to talk. And at the end, I say, there are going to be times that some of you want to stop, but keep in mind, in a year or 2 years, you're going to walk across the stage and you're going to shake this woman's hand as the president. Yeah. And so keep that in mind, because that's kind of, it will keep you going. So really understanding kind of, why am I doing this?
Well, and in your model there, the focus is one thing, to be sort of dialed in, locked in on where you want to go, what you want to be about. But then as you start sort of solving backwards on how you're going to get there, it becomes an exercise in being very intentional with the rest of your time, your 168-hour idea. And I talked to a lot of my clients about that, potentially every one of them. And I think, now that I think about it, we probably get into this discussion, is the idea that we all can go to work every day and we can get busy. It's easy to get busy. There's stuff going on, and you wake up or you stand back at the end of the day and go, what did I really do today? Did the needle move at all, or did I just check a bunch of boxes? And for that reason, I love the word intentional when it comes to thinking about your own time management, your own prioritization of tasks. And you can get into all the really intriguing models of time management and that sort of thing. But I think it all still boils down to that idea of being intentional. Okay, my goal is over here. My focus is over here. This is the thing I want to achieve. What can I do today to get there? And what piece can I chip away at to, get to the end? And, the old classic analog, how to eat an elephant one bite at a time. Well, I always said, well, who wants to eat an elephant? But
it is. I mean, it's if you look at that 168 hours, and one of the exercises I do with some of my coaching clients, but also I do it in the graduate course on leadership I teach, is I have people break down their week in terms of where they're spending their time. And I break it down really up roughly into 3 categories. And I do this in the book as well, is how much time do you spend at work? And that's a relatively easy one to figure. And you can include in your commute time there if you want. It's like, okay, you're from here to here. So, okay, 50 hours. How much time do you spend sleeping? And that's a relatively easy one to calculate. Okay, what time do you normally get in bed? What time do you get out? All right, if you're sleeping eight hours a day, that's 56 hours. So then you back in, and then you have that third bucket of, you take the work plus the sleep, and you subtract that from 168 hours, you got that third bucket. And that third bucket is everything else. It's watching TV, it's reading a book, it's eating, it's playing with your kids, it's going to sports, it's sitting on the couch, and so that is your bucket to play with. Unless you can, I mean, you probably don't want to adjust sleep too much, but maybe you can adjust work. I don't know. But play with that third bucket and figure out, okay, where am I spending the time? And what I often find is, and I've done this kind of hundreds and hundreds of times, is most people have between 50 and 70 hours in that bucket. And as one of the guys I interviewed, he's a chief human resources officer, he's an Ironman. And I asked him, I said, how do you train for an Ironman when you're working long hours? He goes, I know I need 12 hours a week to train. And I can easily find 12 hours. And so how do you then find those 12 hours? So when people come to me and it's like, oh man, I can't do it, I don't have the time. People often say that, I don't have the time to get to the gym. Okay. How much, what could you take away to do it? So it's that focus.
Well, and it comes back to that whole idea of intentionality. Okay, if sleep doesn't change, work doesn't change, you got the 50-something hours, what can you change in there to find those 12? And if that doesn't work for you, because, what went through my mind as you're saying that, well, obviously those other 50, that's family, that's relationship, that's all those other life things that, we deal with. Where are those prioritized and how are those being dealt with? Or are they getting squeezed out somehow in favor of something else? So maybe it does go back to that 80 hours or so in the work bucket and say, I got to change this. And I would think that then if somebody's really doing this work and they know their priorities aren't quite getting met, they could focus on that work bucket and say, okay, now what am I doing at work that's not really efficient? Could I save and avoid 12 hours there so that I've got 12 hours to do that other thing that is a priority for me?
And it's being honest. I mean, some people say, "Oh, yeah, I should cut out work and spend more time with the family." If that's not your priority, be honest about it.
Right.
So I'm not judging you whether you're going to spend 80 hours of work and less with the family. Just be clear about it. And when I was training for the 200-mile run, I knew I had 168 hours. There were some weeks where I was having to exercise 30 hours a week. Something had to give. It was either going to come from the work bucket or the family bucket. It couldn't come from the sleep bucket because I was actually needed more sleep just from a recovery perspective. So it had to come from something. And I, at the time, made a conscious effort to reduce some of the consulting hours. So I was able to reduce my work bucket because I didn't want to miss out on certain family events. And so what that meant is there were times I would get up at 3 a.m. and go run 30 miles or 25 miles and then, or whatever it was, and then be in an 8 o'clock soccer game for my kids. And, I would take a nap in the afternoon, but it's being intentional about it and being very open about this is why I'm doing it. There may be times where it's like, all right, I've got to work 80 hours a week for the next year. And some things are going to give. But then when I'm done, I'm going to kind of, change and I'm going to focus a little bit more here. And that's okay as well. I know early on in my career, I was working a lot more than at other times.
Right.
And so how do you balance? You don't have to balance it out on a week basis. But again, if you find, and I have a good friend of mine who he says, I want to spend more time with his family, but he probably works 80 hours a week and he's been doing that all his life. It's like, okay, your priority is business. And so don't say your priority is, kind of the family in this case. So it's being very intentional and being very clear.
Right. Right. Well, the last thing that comes to my mind about this is that whatever you then end up deciding on your allocation and prioritization, my word of encouragement there is be present in that moment. When it shifts from work to family, make the shift, be the family guy when you say this is family time, and do the best you can to, be the work guy when you say this is work. Don't let it all get muddled and crisscross there. Be intentional. We're back to that word again.
Yeah, no, I think that word, I mean, it is really powerful and probably underused more so. It's,
I
how we're
agree.
being very deliberate, very intentional of where we want to go and what we want to accomplish.
Totally agree. Well, with that, Bryan, I think we're going to bring this one to a close. Thank you so much for coming in again. As always, it's a pleasure to get with you and hear your new amazing journeys. And I'm thinking to myself, mental note, a few months from now, I need to check back, and no telling what you will have done by then.
Well, I hope within a few months I will have been standing on the top of Kilimanjaro. That's our next big goal. Doug, it was a pleasure talking with you again. Congratulations on soon to be 300 episodes. That is quite an amazing accomplishment.
Well, I appreciate that, Bryan, and thank you. So, as we always do here, tell the folks the best way to get a hold of you if they're interested in knowing more about your work and your books and journey and all.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. So, a couple ways to get in touch with me is you can go to epicperformances.com. That's EPIC, performances with an S.com. And that'll get you into my website, and you can learn more about the book, learn more about what I do around consulting, or connect with me on LinkedIn. Bryan Gillette, and it's Bryan Gillette, just like the razor blade.
All right. Well, thank you. And with that, folks, we're going to sign off, say goodbye. I do always like to remind you, we've got a video version of this show over on YouTube, channel by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Hop over there, leave us a comment, let us know if you've got an idea of a future show or a guest you might suggest. But with that, we're going to say goodbye. Go out there, make it a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.